out some of our other great breakout sessions. Information about those and anything else about the convention will be in your program book or on Sketch. So lunch is on your own, but there's a meetup today for the Women's Plus members. So grab your lunch and head up to Parlor 413 for that one.
Finally, let's introduce you to our wonderful plenary this morning. If the panelists would like to come up and get seated on the stage here, that would be great. Today's plenary will be moderated by an exceptional talent, Orion Rumler. Orion is a no stranger to the Association of LGBTQ Journalists. In 2018, he won a place on our organization's student project, and then after graduation quickly rose to the ranks, working for Axios, and now working for the 19th News, covering everything LGBTQ+, with a focus on state politics, breaking news, and the underreported ways that trans and queer people are marginalized. Last year, he came back to mentor students in the student project, and today, he has brought together an exceptional panel this morning. Take it away, Orion.
Thanks so much, y'all. Thanks for being here. I would love to introduce y'all to our panelists this year. Really excited for this conversation. Beatrice, would you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Beatrice L. Thomas. I use they and she pronouns. I am an cultural equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant in the Bay Area, as well as the former chair of the National Board of Drag Queen Story Hour and an active Story Hour performer. Yeah.
Is this on? Hi.
Oh, yeah, please.
Hi, I am Kate Ruan. My pronouns are she, her. I'm really honored to be here and want to thank the Ford Foundation. This is incredible. I am the U.S. Free Expression Programs Director for PEN America, and I look forward to the discussion.
There we go. Also really honored to be here. This is my first time at the NLGJA conference, so thanks for having me, and thanks to the Ford Foundation for bringing me out. My name is Stephen Monticelli. I work with the Texas Observer as the Special Investigative Correspondent. I'm based in Dallas.
Thanks, y'all, for being here. So, as Amara just spoke to, there's a greater conversation around anti-LGBTQ laws, anti-trans laws. Today, we're focusing on anti-drag laws, and to kind of table set for some background on the status of that. There's 6 states that have passed a law that would restrict drag. 2 of them, it's Montana and Tennessee, it's explicitly restricting drag, and then 4 of them, they restrict adult performances that would affect drag, and in 4 of those states, those anti-drag laws have been temporarily blocked in court. So that's the current status we're looking at. So that's not a lot of laws, especially compared to the number of laws we've seen about gender-affirming care and all these other categories, but it's still important to talk about anti-drag laws and how they affect gender expression for everybody, even if you're not trans. So that's part of what we're gonna touch on today. And another important piece of context is that in a recent survey from the Anti-Defamation League and GLAAD, they actually found that drag events and drag performers were the most frequent targets of anti-LGBTQ hate and extremism from June 2022 to April this year. And that was mostly harassment. That was a lot of acts of hate. So drag performers are facing a lot of hatred right now. So that's the situation we're looking at. Excited to hear y'all's thoughts. And Kate, you're with PEN America, focused on free expression. I'd love to know, what are your top concerns around freedom of speech, especially of anti-drag legislation? Do you have thoughts about the broad implications these kind of restrictions have for LGBTQ people?
Sure, yes. So this is hardly the first time that legislators have chosen to try to suppress the speech of LGBTQ people specifically in the name of protecting children. as though seeing or encountering the existence of or the speech of LGBTQ people is somehow harmful to children. And so like that was the beginning of the anti-drag legislation introduction. You started to see these things, and it was like, this is harmful to children. It's pornography. It is obscene. And you know, and these things are happening despite the fact that, you know, we've already had this fight and decided that's not true. But that's not the point, right? The point is to introduce into the legal system in these states the permission on the part of anybody that wants to suppress this speech. And then the fear, and then to instill fear in those who would engage in it, that they will be prosecuted, harassed, thrown in jail as a result of engaging in it. And so like initially the idea is like this is about drag shows, but it isn't really. When you read the legislation, it could apply far more broadly than that. It could apply to you know, a trans person walking around in their daily life because they would be dressed in a way that was gender nonconforming and therefore against what this legislation says in a public space where children could see them. So that's one way that it is broader. Another way that it winds up being broader is school plays. Oftentimes school plays, just that simple stuff, like daily life is going to be affected by these things should they ever go into effect. And to be very clear, even though many of them haven't been able to go into effect, they still have had a negative impact within the states where they have been just simply introduced. Like the uncertainty that comes from these attacks, the uncertainty for the bookstores, the libraries, the restaurants that host drag shows, or would even host a trans author of a book or a trans musical performer, if they don't know what their liability would be under the law, should the state come calling, that can be enough. That can be enough to silence people. That can be enough to destroy people's livelihoods. And so like I think my main point is like, we're talking about drag shows. This is about drag shows. This is about suppressing drag shows, but it's about more than that too. It's about more than that too, and it's about more than whether it's legal, because that kind of doesn't matter sometimes. Because if people are afraid, they self-censor. If people are afraid, they don't engage. If insurance companies are afraid, they say, even if you want to do it, we're not going to insure you, or we're going to charge you 550% more, right? So this is about more than that, and it's going to affect, it's not just going to affect our community, it's going to affect everybody. And one of the things that like I try to do is, while focusing on who is being attacked, also try to remind people it's not just, like this is applying to you right now. If you don't think so, if you don't think that anti-drag bans have something to do with you, but you have a daughter in high school who likes to engage in theater, this is going to hurt her too. Like, think about how it applies to you. So those are I have much more to say. I'm gonna stop because other people have a lot, but like, yes, I'm very concerned.
Thank you so much, Kate. And Beatrice, you're doing San Francisco Story Hour. You do a lot more for the performing arts and for drag. And when Kate's talking about the effects, even if a law isn't in effect, even if it's if you're not in a state where it's happening, what kind of effects have you seen in your work?
It's happening in my state. We're getting protested. We had a beautiful Pride event where we traveled all around the Bay Area, the liberal Bay Area, and we were protested, honey, and we were outnumbered. I tell you that. I don't know. Word to get out, but we were outnumbered, and the people who were on the front lines were queers and trans folks, right? Just like we were on the front lines. I was in drag performing to people who did not deserve my performance, but in my mind, that's my tool. Those are my tools for change. And so I thought, I'm about to give you this number. It's about to be on. I'm gonna transform hearts and minds. No, because the hearts and minds are uninformed. They do not have the facts. There's a lot of retired people. San Lorenzo, I can speak really specifically to the library in San Lorenzo. I was out there talking to people. I'm trying to understand what's going on, and there's misinformation. People do not know what's happening inside of the library. They don't know about our program. They don't know about the trainings and protocols that we put in place that are in alignment with our public school systems. They don't know any of that. They have assumptions, and there's not a willingness to engage in an exchange of dialogue. I try. It's happening. They're showing up. There's the retired folks are showing up. Church groups are showing up, and it is creating a challenge for the youth and the families that are trying to access equitable and inclusive programming that is truly for all.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. And this is a question for all of us at one point, especially your thoughts on this. But I wanted to go to Stephen on this first you reported last December on how Republican-endorsed groomer rhetoric inspired armed fascist groups to harass queer events, and Beatrice just told us about protesters at an event. When you're reporting that story, and after reporting that story, do you have tips for other reporters on how to cover extremist groups who may be showing up to drag events?
Great question. As Orion said, in Texas, a lot of the anti-drag protests that we've seen over the last 2 years have been organized by these, what I would call astroturf groups that emerged only recently in direct response and, frankly, in correlation with, if not coordination with, these larger efforts to target LGBTQ communities through state policy as well as school board policies. And these protests have regularly attracted outright fascist groups, if not neo-Nazis, sometimes who are armed. It's attracted pro-Confederate militia groups in Texas. And these protests have effectively become a nexus point for these extremist groups to not only promote their ideology, but to demonstrate an unfortunate fact, which is that they are mobilized by this rhetoric, and they endorse this rhetoric that drag shows are grooming children, or that drag or that trans people are inherently sexualized and therefore pornographic and obscene and must be effectively pushed out of public life. That's what we're dealing with in states like Texas. And unfortunately, the presence of these extremist groups often is disregarded by those that are pushing this at the state level and seeking to pass the policies that would then enact this into law. In terms of tips for how do you report on these groups or how do you interact with them, do your research. Know what you're getting into if you're going to an event like this. A lot of these events are published ahead of time on social media where they primarily organize. These groups that have these innocuous sounding names like the Texas Family Project or Protect Texas Kids, those should be clues into what sort of rhetoric that they promote and what sort of rhetoric they're calling back to. As was already mentioned on this panel, this is not new to associate the LGBTQ community with pedophilia or with child grooming. These are tropes that are as old as the civil rights movement for LGBTQ people. And as an ally, these are not necessarily my rights that are on the line, but I can see clearly that they are civil rights, not political issues. Civil rights that are universal and must be protected. And we have to be clear about reporting on what the intent of these extremist groups actually is. And if you take them at their word, it is to push people out of public life. It is to revoke civil rights. One of the organizers of these groups, the organizer of Protect Texas Kids, quite literally said we should start rounding up people at pride parades. They have self-identified themselves as a Christian fascist. So these are things that take place in social media out in the open, and unfortunately reporters don't always pay attention to what these people are saying. They only pay attention to what they tell them in the interview that they hold. So if you're going to interview people who are engaging in this sort of campaign, you need to know what you're doing, because otherwise you may just end up giving them a platform to spread their hate and to take away the civil rights of the people that you love.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And on the rhetoric we've talked about with grooming and how it's focused on children, I was wondering if your thoughts on that, Kate, on how that specific rhetoric, if you see that as especially dangerous when it's focused on, we need to protect the children.
Yes, it is specifically dangerous, I mean, socially, because it's appealing to people. But legally speaking, it's also really dangerous. There is a bit of legal gray area around whether around the degree to which the government can restrict speech in order to protect children. The anti-drag legislation we've seen is far past the line, so that it's all pretty clearly unconstitutional under current case law. But my concern actually builds on what Stephen just said, in that this is about civil rights, but I see it already. I see it already. The campaign is to broaden the definition of obscenity, which is an exception to the First Amendment. Obscenity can be restricted without constitutional concern. And so the campaign is to broaden the definition of obscenity to include any speech at all that relates to or indicates LGBTQ identities. They're at the beginning of it, but we have to remember that it was a 50-year campaign to overturn Roe. These folks are patient. Right? These folks are patient in undermining civil rights. They will take their time. They will take losses and go back. They will take losses and adjust. And that is what they are doing now. That is what the anti-drag that is what all of the anti-LGBTQ legislation right now is about. It is about excluding LGBTQ people from public life. Create speech, create exceptions to the First Amendment to ensure that we cannot advocate for ourselves, create laws that prevent people from, or make it harder for people to identify as who they are in public, or you know, if they want to, you know, play sports in schools, they have to conform. That is what this is about. So that it is all couched in the idea of protecting children. That it is this is dangerous for children, and so the government needs more authority to restrict LGBTQ people's freedom. Like that is what I see happening, and that is what will happen if we are not able to stop it. If we aren't able to stop it now, if we aren't able to see it, report on it, fight against it in every possible venue where we see the threat, that is where they are going. They are attempting to erase LGBTQ people from public life entirely, in my view, personal view.
Thank you so much, Kate. And Beatrice, when Stephen was mentioning a platform, like when reporters have to be careful not to just platform protesters, in our previous discussion, you'd mentioned like that was one of your tips for reporters. Could you talk more about that and any other tips you have?
Well, I want to circle back to that question.
Sure.
And just a few tips, and then I kind of want to move into it. But please stop sharing the times and locations of our events and our names. If you have an audience that is going to be contentious in some way, sharing the times, locations, and names of the performers has actively, this summer of Pride, has put us all in danger. And we had increased protests at our events, and you know, our relationship with police, now we are forced to engage in really active relationships with police officers, which is challenging for an organization that's trying to do things a little differently. So I think, please, that kind of publication is not serving us, but sharing the story of what's happening inside of the story hours, that's what people don't know. They think we're in there go-go dancing for kids. it's not. We're reading. We are asking them questions about their emotions. We're having them demonstrate their brave chest and practice saying no. And doesn't that feel good? No. Now give me attitude. No. Right? Like, this is about voice and empowerment and creating engaged, empowered citizens. And I think that engaged, empowered citizens is maybe not at the heart of folks that have interests that are aligned with various parties like corporations and things, trying to be open. And so we want to we want to really remember, we want to share the story of what's happening, the work, the good work that we're doing, some of the transformative work that we're doing, to let people see what's happening, to let people, feel it. Everyone deserves to be read to. Everyone loves to be read to. So that I will share that. I think that another thing is to get consent, right? To reach out, have dialogues with folks and really get consent. Also lifting up some of our allies. We got a lot of folks on different sides of the aisle who calling us names, but what about the people, what about the Christians who are loving Drag Story Hour? They're out there. I would love to hear their stories. I would love to be connected to them. They're a part, they offer a rich perspective to what we're doing here and what we're trying to achieve in terms of equity. People are making threats online, so when they get to show up, we're even more terrified because I'm getting death threats. If something happens in the media, then we can get a spike in our death threats, and that is new for me. That's a new, regular, everyday experience. That's a new, regular, everyday experience. I'm gonna say stop resting on objectivity. Stop debating gender. These are human rights issues. It's true. These are human rights issues, right? And they are ideologies and laws that seek to reduce our civil liberties and our right to self-determine as Americans specifically and as humans globally. Gender is not up for debate. It's not objective. It is a spectrum, and only the subject can define where they're on it. Good press elevates us. Bad press puts us in danger. Protect us. Make sure your teams and crews are competent culturally. Also, distinguish between drag performers and the trans community, okay? Drag queens include trans folks, but not every trans folk is a drag queen or a drag performer. Also, start using drag performer because we're a really inclusive community and there are so many, we are a gender-full community. And we are all experiencing the same challenges. So there, we can offer language changes in journalism. Like, y'all are words people, okay? Like, let's do things with language, right? I know, I'm gonna stop now. I'm just gonna go ahead and stop.
We have a lot of time. Do you have other tips on that, or?
Just ask, that's all I say, it's just ask. Please help us report, the magic that's happening inside of schools, right? We're doing school events. We have a lot of training. Please let people know about the training that we do to work with autistic children, to work with blind and deaf children. Like, we would love to share those techniques and tools because we really believe that queerness, there's an article by Little Miss Hot Mess and Harper Keenan on the pedagogy of drag, the playful pedagogy of drag. And it looks at queerness as an essential part of innovation and change. There's no innovation without difference, without perspectives. And so we say with Drag Story Hour is that we have, as a cultural community, as a culture, we have tools, techniques, and strategies that all children can benefit from. All children can benefit from the internal fire that we have had to develop. We have techniques, we have tools, and we want citizens. We want beautiful citizens, active citizens with a perspective of love. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I follow on that?
Yes, please.
Part of what I was talking about is how we have to counter it everywhere. And what Beatrice just highlighted is the joy, like the absolute joy and amazingness in this community that like is part of the fight, right? I was moved to tears just now. Like that was beautiful. Thank you.
I also just wanted to follow up on some of these concrete tips in terms of reporting on these sorts of events. I typically focus on extremism, so oftentimes the headline or the lead will not be so joyous. But I find that the better reporting that I've done on these subjects, on these events, not only showcases the hate and does it in a way that is careful to not amplify it. If you're familiar with the oxygen of amplification, that's a very important concept for reporting on extremism. But the joyous part is essential, and the community response to the extremism I find to be the most interesting and impactful sort of story that I can tell. Because I've been able to tell stories of, dozens of parents showed up to a library in McKinney, Texas, where Proud Boys and other extremists were outside trying to get inside so that they could harass the drag story hour. They didn't get inside. And that was a good outcome. It showed that just because the headlines about Texas being so bad, being one of the states where these bans have been passed, it doesn't mean that that's actually reflective of the communities that live there. And within this conversation, we have to recognize that places like Texas are extremely gerrymandered, and there are places where voter suppression still is rampant. There are communities that are not mobilized to vote because they feel as though they have no real impact in the political system. So telling those stories, I find, has been inspirational to other people because they've seen that actually, no, there is a response to this, and it starts from the community up, and that we can simultaneously showcase that the community is under threat while also demonstrating that it is self-sufficient and it is willing to protect itself. And that not only is it willing to protect itself, but there are many allies who are willing to join in that effort. So I think if you're going to end up reporting on a bunch of armed fascists showing up to a drag show, make sure that you showcase how beautiful the show was. Make sure that you talk to the people who were there and give voice to them about why did they come and why did they think it was important to support the free expression of the fellow humans that they live near.
Absolutely. Go ahead. Did you have more thoughts about that?
This is an ally moment, right? It's a moment to parents. We got a lot of parents, not just queer parents, but we have a lot of ally parents, and this is a moment to mobilize them. We're busy reading to children in drag. It's a very important work, and we need support from external communities to capture parents' voices. Why are you bringing your kid to drag story hour? What change has it had in your child's life? What isn't in school that this program provides you with? I think those are voices that people really hear. Those are stories and narratives that are really a part of the work that we're doing.
Thank you, and that actually goes to my next question, which is, I think you've already touched on this, but what are the positive effects you've seen when doing a drag story hour? Do you have thoughts on what's the importance or joy in showing kids there's different ways to be yourself? You mentioned the proud chest. What kind of impacts have you seen?
So the article that Little Miss Hot Mess and Harper Keenan wrote, the playful practice of drag pedagogy, looks at play as praxis. So playing as we play in the queer community. We play, we have this, we are claiming joy. okay, right? We're claiming joy. So play and joy are essential, and we actually have to learn how to cultivate joy. It's not something you're just born, knowing how to do. We have embodied kinship, so being able to use your imagination to step into literally someone else's shoes or heels. Being invited to have, what it is it, they have better word here. Oh, strategic defiance. That's one of my favorite ones, because we're teaching kids to use their voice. We're teaching them about boundaries. It's like, I love you, you love me, please go away, it's just a boundary. It's like, not right now, it's okay, let's try another day, right? Like, these are really good. I wish that I had had that lesson growing up. And so I think that we really are giving kids tools that are going to help them succeed. Being able to be in a room with someone who looks wild like drag queens is actually a wonderful exercise for engaging difference, right? And being like, I'm okay, I really am okay, and you're okay, and you can look just like that, and we can really vibe. This is going to bring us together as a community. So I think the playing destigmatization, that's another one, which is just like, it's all good. Look at all this diversity. Don't judge a book by its cover. Judge a book by its actions, and teach kids about integrity, right? So we are really like, what is integrity? I ask them a bunch of questions, and then I'm like, when you feel something in your heart, and you just know that it's the right thing to do, if you go against that, you're going against your integrity. Say integrity with me. Integrity, right? Like, it's like kids just want to yell. They want to, but while they're doing that, all that, we glamorize reading, y'all. We glamorize education. You see them light up. You see them light up. Another important thing is the parents that come to these events are coming from non-traditional families, and I don't just mean queer parents. I mean single parents. I mean caretaking folks who are caretakers for children, grandparents. They're coming and meeting each other. So what we see, we had a drag ball for kids. It was protested. And the families, everybody was servicing the work, was just crying, but it was the families. It was grannies meeting grannies. It was aunties meeting aunties, and sharing and exchanging, right, their experience with a non-binary kid, a trans kid, and that makes community. It's like grandma came out with a buddy that they can converse with. So we are creating spaces for real exchange. So I have seen just joy, just joy. People light up. They just, or the kids, like the goober heads, right? The ones that are short and kind of gummy. And they just kind of walk towards the sequence, and they ask you if you're a mermaid. And this is a wonderful time. What a wonderful, yes, I am a mermaid. Yes. That is, in fact, what I am. You have met a mermaid. What do you know of my kind? I'm sold.
I'm obsessed, and I'm going to use that boundary song at some point. And I also think we should implement the integrity chant in newsrooms. Yeah. And yes. Kate, I was hoping for more of your thoughts on, because we're talking about tips for reporters covering these events and the protesters around them, but you were getting into, I think, a deeper conversation around what this means constitutionally with the groomer rhetoric, and those parts of it. So do you have tips for reporters when they're reporting on this? What resources can they use, or what should they know about the law when they're reporting on this if they want to go into that deeper element about that rhetoric and what it means?
Sorry, I might not be the best person to answer this question, I'll be honest. I think, I really don't know. I really don't know. I think that you really do have to think a lot about how to describe what you see without amplifying it, which I think, we've touched on a little bit in this panel already. But in terms of what resources to use to counter it, I think it's really important. I think language is incredibly important. So talk about, I'm a First Amendment lawyer. I cannot pretend that there is no power in the language that I fight every day to protect. And so I think it's really important that when you describe, what this groomer rhetoric, that you also describe the reality of the situation, use proper pronouns, use gender-inclusive language in the rest of the story. If you're going to be talking about what the extremist says, if you're going to be talking about what the politician has said, please don't just put out the press release. Please don't pretend that's the story. Talk about people in a gender-inclusive way. Use proper pronouns and look at the reporters' guides. I think I just saw a guide put out for trans-inclusive language by one of the major, LGBTQ civil society organizations. Go to things like that to find out how to cover these things, and talk about the reality. Don't just say the politician says that drag shows harm children. Make sure you talk about what he's really talking about when he says that. What is a drag show? What is a drag show that permits children? There are significant standards that are applied by the community. Beatrice has talked about it. Don't let them get away with shaping the conversation without evidence, with just baseless stuff. There's baseless rhetoric put out there, and I feel like some of the stories don't interrogate the narrative behind some of these efforts. So be careful with language. Interrogate motivations. Interrogate the reality behind how things are being characterized.
As to grooming, right? Language. Grooming has a definition. The definition is not when a queer person dons drag and reads to your children. Grooming is actually, it ranges from your personal care and appearance to, I was groomed. I was groomed by my Black family hard to go to school, to do this. Grooming happens, right? It is not, so I'm like, can we take the sting out of this grooming? Can we start with just a definition so that we're like, okay, if you're gonna play in my article, let me give you some definitions so we're all working on the same page. But I will just say that another fact that we can explore is that child molestation went up during the pandemic, right? We went online. So this notion that we are directly connected to grooming and the harming of children can be debunked. Can we talk about who is harming children, where they're being harmed? There's information and data on that. And if we can share that information and data alongside telling the story of the joy and the platform we can give children to be their unique, authentic selves, I think it's a great and important counterbalance.
Thank you so much. And Stephen, I was wondering if you had thoughts on what Beatrice and Kate just mentioned about the importance of language, especially being specific. And I appreciate it, Kate. I think part of what you're referring to is in some of these laws, in a lot of anti-LGBTQ laws, it's very strange, precise language that sometimes doesn't mean anything, including this one where some of the laws are just about, you can't be performing in drag if a child might possibly be near you, which, how do you understand that? But do you have thoughts about the importance of language and how you've covered this in Texas?
Absolutely. Well, we're all writers or editors or people who work around people who are writers or editors. So words are important to us. They mean things. Your editor will jump down your throat if you're using the wrong word for something, if they're maybe a bit of a mean editor, or they'll tell you nicely that that's not the right word for that. And likewise, whenever we're interviewing subjects, whenever we're about to run quotes, if they're going to use a word that doesn't mean what they intend it to mean or does not have this common meaning, that's a strategy that they're trying to employ. They're trying to get you to help them create a rhetorical shift where suddenly this word means this new thing, or we expand the meaning of obscenity, we expand the meaning of pornography, we expand the meaning of grooming. Sexual grooming is a specific thing, and if you want to be concerned about it, there's a lot of really good journalism out there about some nonprofit organizations that also preach things that have histories of this. It's a very hypocritical thing to hear from people who simultaneously disregard sexual grooming in institutions like Southern Baptist Convention in Texas, but are so hopped up about this imagined set of, incidences or these crimes that they allege are being committed. It is unacceptable that we are allowing people to make baseless allegations of pedophilia in the news against people simply for who they are, how they choose to express themselves. And so when this happens, when you're reporting on a story and they use this language, ask them, what do you mean? Can you give me examples? How are you using this word? Why are you using these words? And if they don't give you acceptable answers, well, it's your job to make a judgment and come to some conclusions about why they're using these words. Sometimes when I quote people who, may be characterized fairly as extremists on this issue, it's because I'm trying to help illustrate that they have an internal bias and that they are deploying this language in a very particular way. And then I speak to others who perhaps are more qualified to dissect what does this word mean, why does it mean what it means, and what is the history of the usage of this word. I think a lot has already been said on this panel about this, so I don't think I need to say much more other than, don't be a megaphone for hate, period. It's pretty easy not to do. It's a lot harder to thread the needle and talk about hate while not demonstrating it. And unfortunately, not talking about it is also unacceptable because it's the reality of what we're dealing with right now. So it is our responsibility. And sometimes that may end up being perceived as being an adversarial journalist. But this is just my personal opinion. I like living in a democracy where we have civil rights. And the First Amendment protects me from arbitrary bullshit, excuse my language, and it doesn't allow for the state to crack down on my expression, so it shouldn't allow for that to happen to others just because of who they are. And so if it means that you have to be a partisan on the side of free expression or democracy, I would personally recommend that you do that and that you be a partisan, because your job and our entire industry is predicated on the rights that we are given as members of a democracy that has something like the First Amendment. So use words carefully and protect people's rights. It's a part of our job, and it's a part of what keeps this industry going.
We need your articles to counter, to send to people, right? I can't do the research or write this. So we need other articles when people are sending us craziness. It would be great to have your work to share, to put out there. We need counterbalances to what is a very well-oiled media machine that denigrates.
Came to mind to me. There's a paper, or rather a news website in Dallas that started in recent years. It's funded by a highly political donor who has made a number of issues, including trans healthcare, a personal pet issue. And they've tried to flex their muscles in this regard. And you can just read their articles and you can see this rhetorical shift happening in real time. They like to call the houseless or homeless, whichever word your paper may choose, vagrants. And this is a highly funded news website that now has more than, I think, 40 employees and a bunch of contractors. While places like the Texas Tribune are firing people, the place that I work at has undergone an existential crisis. The Texas Observer this year, you may have read about it. And other news outlets are shrinking or are struggling as well. And so the reality is that, yes, there is a well-funded, well-oiled propaganda machine, a hate machine, that journalists can counter without becoming propagandists themselves. If you just tell the truth and you focus on things like our universal human rights and the meaning of words, you don't have to become a mirror image of the thing that we're trying to fight against.
Thank you so much. And for what you just mentioned of newsrooms who are losing resources or losing people for whatever crisis they're facing, I'd appreciate all your thoughts, if you all have thoughts on this, on how if a reporter wants to cover this, maybe hasn't before, it needs to argue to their editor why covering this is important, especially within the broader frame of anti-LGBTQ laws, but why reporting on, drag performances face so much hate this past year, as we saw from ADL. Like, how should a reporter make a case for, no, this is important to our community?
Great question. There's a couple of ways that I think you can do this if you're struggling in your newsroom or struggling with editors to get them to understand why this is important. One is you can just point to the articles in certain outlets that make it a habit of stoking outrage around this. It's a one-sided narrative. And it's my view that you just can't leave it alone. You can't allow there to be a monopoly on the discourse, particularly when it is so one-sided and hateful. So pointing to the fact that, Fox News is running a lot of stories about this right now, or at least my local Fox outlet, and it doesn't seem like all perspectives are being included here. Not to denigrate Fox in particular, but there is a reality that some of the surface level reporting around these things, it just ends up being, oh, this is a political flashpoint, and it doesn't delve into, okay, so what are the implications of this political flashpoint? So spelling it out to your editors that there are impacts for real people as well, that it's not just drag queens or drag kings, but anyone who wants to explore expression and free expression, whether that is going shopping or performing in a gender-bending Shakespeare play. I was a theater major in college, and it shocks me that some of these laws would make it so that you can't perform Shakespeare in the way that Shakespeare may have originally been performed. Impact, the fact that there is a running narrative and that there are lots of articles that are getting clicks and views, so that you can not only talk about the impact, but also the fact that, yes, most news outlets need clicks and views in order to keep living. So it is something that people want to read about, and I think there's plenty of statistics that you can point to, while also simultaneously emphasizing that it's not just about the clicks, it's not just about the views, it's about real people's lives.
Also a lot of folks who feel opposed to drag performance, there are so many of the popular voices that have pictures where they're in drag, or they wore the costume, or it's dismissed. That's clearly a joke. Is it? I would love a report. Can we gather all of the pictures of those folks who have been in drag? Like, throw blackface in there. That's reporting too. I want the parody. I want to reveal, so you get to be the only arbiter of this. So it's a joke. How do we determine if this is a joke, or can we get parody? I want those things revealed. That sort of double speak, or that double standard.
I would also argue for, in addition to all of that, for finding the angles that aren't being covered. In my work, I talk to legislators, I talk to other policy professionals, all of the time. And my whole goal is like, how do I convince these people not to do this? How? Because 90% of the time, they do not care about the Constitution. They don't even really care about, drag performers, whether they're allowed to perform or not. That's not what they care about. They care about whether they're going to get reelected. They care about how this is moving their community. And so, we talk about what would convince them. And one of the things that has come up that convinces them to not do this is business leaders going to them and saying, please don't do this. Like, this is going to cost me a ridiculous amount of money. And so what is that ridiculous amount of money? And I don't know. Like, I haven't seen the reporting on it. Finding those angles, I think, would be really, it would be helpful generally. But I think if you're looking for a way into this, that is another one. That is another one. Like, what are the other impacts that this has outside of the community that is clearly the target? And why? Why do politicians who probably don't care one way or the other what the final outcome is on the bill, why would they vote for it or why would they vote against it? And sometimes it's not, I don't like drag performance. Often, in fact, it isn't. And so what are those other motivations that are at play that can be put out into the public to help the public understand what's really happening in their state house? And that can help people like me be able to make those arguments in other places. If somebody did it in Texas, I could take that and go someplace else with it and say, I'll bet this is happening here. Like, things like that. Like, think about who you, think granularly about your audience. Think about me as your audience. I'm begging you. But I could see that being another way into this discussion.
To piggyback on that quickly, at least in Texas, there's a very clear overlap between anti-drag activism and the sort of activism that creeps into school districts and searches for ways to either change the policies in school districts, to restrict inclusion around LGBTQ students, to pull back access or remove books from libraries, and even things like quote unquote school choice or school vouchers and the push to privatize public education. These are other ways that you can tie this phenomenon into other issues and stories. Because like I said, in Texas, the leaders of these anti-drag organizations, the ones that are leading the protests, they're also showing up at school boards. And they're also often advocating for school choice. Follow the money, try and figure out why is this all seemingly tied together. And unfortunately, due to things like 501c4s that never have to reveal their funds, sometimes we may never know unless you happen to get the right source. So think about the intersections, as Kate was saying, and tie it into a broader narrative so that it isn't presented so narrowly, because it certainly isn't being protested or criminalized narrowly. In my view, it is a part of a much larger effort.
If there are any beauty reporters out there, it would be very fascinating to know how much money the trans, non-binary, and drag community spend on beauty products, right? It's a lot. It gave you're just like tracing the money can work both ways. The money that's being made and that it stands to be lost, but also the money that is funding. So thank you for that.
I love that idea. I hadn't thought about that, but it is so much. So we have about 10 minutes left. Wasn't sure if we had any questions or if the plenary panels do questions, but it's too late. If anybody has questions, hello. Thank you.
Like Texas, protect Texas kids. How can you and I both know that any publicity is good publicity for her. How do we expose who they are without giving them that boost that they want to get?
So, great question. I would somewhat challenge the idea that all publicity is good publicity. In the sense that you can give more smoke than oxygen whenever you're covering some of these things. It's just a little analogy that I think of in terms of how much space are you giving them to express their sort of unbridled extremist positions relative to some detailing of who they are, what are their motivations, who do they hang out with, who are they connected to, who shows up and is in support of their rhetoric, who are these protests activating. Unfortunately, I have seen some coverage. I'm not going to name names because I'm not here to shame anybody today, but I did see a bit of a profile on the leader of this group that I would say treated them with kid gloves and in fact helped boost their profile and even quoted them, giving them their own sort of moniker as the most hated college student in Texas. Her brother works for a certain state rep that I won't specify who, and he's an outright Christian nationalist and says so online and posts about it and has ties to other extremist groups, like if anyone's familiar with Nick Fuentes and his whole Groyper army. So when you get to know who these people are, it's pretty clear who they are. They make it quite known. Their signs use all the right rhetoric. And whenever the fascist groups show up at their events, they carry their big flags and they're all dressed in unison together. It is a thing that we have to be very careful with, though, because it's probably not worth just penning a little article about one of their crappy little protests if no one really shows up, if there's no real disruption, if there's no point to it. All you would be doing would be giving them a platform. But it's important to track and monitor these sorts of events if you're in this beat, because over time, things start to reveal themselves. It turns out that this person who leads this group is also a member of another group called the New Columbia Movement, which was founded by a guy who used to run an organization called the American Black Shirts, which was basically a Mussolini fan club. They're pretty open about who they are. You just have to understand what the words mean, what the history is. If you ever hear someone using the phrase third positionism, you might want to go Google that and learn about what they're calling back to. Because unfortunately, if you don't know that stuff, and then you get assigned to go write an article, you may just end up leaning on what's right in front of you. And that would tend to be their rhetoric, them. So if you're going to profile someone like this, you better know a lot about what they're up to, what their motivations are, what they've said. But if you're a good journalist, you can do that. And it's pretty straightforward for these sorts of self-promoting type organizations. But unfortunately, that person, the leader of that group, was invited to speak at the state capitol as a witness in support of this anti-drag law. And unfortunately, not a lot of the coverage of that, specified exactly who this person is and what their motivations are and the sort of things that they've said and the sort of people that they seem to attract. So, my general recommendation would be don't report on these sorts of things unless you know what you're doing, because you could actually do a lot more harm than good.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And I think I see two more questions. Go to you in the back first. I think I saw your hand first.
Okay, sure. Hi there. So I cover U.S. politics, and a term that is a mainstay of political coverage at many outlets is culture wars. I wonder how you all see the use of that term.
Extremely poorly is how I view that term. If I use that term, I use it in quotes. It's not a culture war. It's an attempt to roll back civil rights for entire groups of people. If you call that a culture war, I don't know what the definition of culture is for you or a war is for you. Because a war involves guns usually, and I think we get figurative sometimes in our use of language, and that can betray us. I would push back against the use of that term. I would try to get more specific. What is the culture war? What are the end goals of the culture war? Is the end goal to pass legislation to take away people's civil rights? I would call that a reactionary movement that seeks to take away people's civil rights, not a culture war. But I have strong opinions about this.
And what are y'all's thoughts?
I think we are at war. I think that I was raised in the, my dad was an activist. I was raised in the cultural equity movement, and one of my mentors came in when I was like, I'm trying to figure out how to love everybody, but also like see equity happen. And she sat me down and gave me a copy of The Art of War and started quoting passages that, you know, were very informative to me. San San Wong, thank you. But I do think we're at war. I don't love culture wars because, of course, it's language that has been developed to dog whistle to what if all of the oppressed people get together on the fact that they are oppressed and come for vengeance. I think that there is a real fear. That's the dog whistle. Oh, so many bad things have happened. If we don't keep them down, they're gonna come in force. And it's like, we're just trying to live our lives. We're like, yes, Cabo, let's do this, you know? Like, but it's used to create this energy and to build these coalitions. So I do feel we're at war. There are guns. So we don't have guns in San Francisco, but in North Carolina, Montana, Arizona, they show up to protest with semi-automatic guns. That's crazy. That's wild. That is wild at a child's event where we're reading books. That's crazy. There is a war. They're coming with guns. So I'm like, how are we mobilizing, right? How are we, where, when we sit in our different positions, how are we figuring out what our steps are, right? Whether you are a doctor, a lawyer, a journalist, where is our role? What can I do? Where do I mobilize? Because we must come together and get networked, and we are not. We are not networked. There's not a way, a national way, to get in touch with all of the LGBTQXYZ plus star. There's not a way to get in touch with us. There's not a way that we have been working underground, right? We are coming into the light. But we have been trading things in our spaces, trading information. We need a national visible network so we can get in touch with our regional communities. We need to mobilize. We don't have those things because we've just been trying to get our basic rights on. So I am like, put yourself towards these larger efforts to bring us together, because that will help us build power in our community. If I can reach you, if I can find you, right? If we can get together, I mean, we are powerful, and we do outnumber folks who are trying to harm, folks who are against equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's outnumbered. The world is not as terrible as people would like to message. But if we can't connect to each other, we can't feel that power. We can't get that juice stuff from our energy and our collective ability. This is a resilient community. This is a resilient community that knows how to get together, organize, and do things. So I'm like, let's look bigger. Let's try to get a bigger vision where we can get interconnected and networked, so we can start really coordinating and mobilizing and still holding joy at the center of it.
Thank you, Beatrice. And Kate, did you have more thoughts, or could I go to the next question? Okay.
I mean, Beatrice just made a really good argument for redefining culture war, right? Because culture war, like when I read it, I'm going to click right out of your article. I am, because you're not, that is whitewashing. That is the same as blaming partisanship, right? That's be like, oh, well, like the partisanship and it's all difficult, but partisanship, like Stephen just said, you know, like what that is like eliding the actual issue. And the actual issue is what Beatrice just talked about. So like maybe it is accurate, but that's not what you mean, and we all know it, right? So that's sort of where I come down on culture wars.
Yeah, just to follow on what you said, Beatrice, I mean, I've been at events where people show up with guns. So, maybe sometimes war is a term that approximates the truth. But at the same time, culture war is more than just a term, it's a frame for talking about issues. Just like, quote unquote, polarization is a frame for talking about issues. Is it a question of, quote unquote, polarization, or is it a question of a particular movement seeking to take away people's rights, which may involve guns, and people showing up with guns? So if you're going to use the term, you should explain exactly what you mean. It's kind of like the term woke. What the hell does that mean? And if you asked 20 people, they may give you different definitions of the term, and it has its own genealogy and history, and it has a definition that has been twisted and turned into something else. And so don't do any favors for people who are seeking to just use words and frames and then get you to do their bidding in using those words and frames. It's our job to unpack those and to put them into, words and frames that actually make sense for people and not aligns the actual issue at play. You don't want to just use a concept that subsumes a bunch of really important details. And that's what our job is about, is revealing some of those details and making them clear.
Thank you. And I think we had one last question. Okay. Well,
That's
I
our
think we have
time, sadly. However, can we give a round of applause to our panel?
So thank you again to the Ford Foundation for supporting this session, and thank you again to my dear friend and mentor, Orion, and to our panelists. If you could all stick around so we can get a group photo, that would be amazing.
And we have breaking news for you. GLAAD is buying us all lunch. All you need to do is show your badge at the Shake Shack at the corner of 12th and Chestnut, which is a block away from the hotel, for a grab-and-go lunch from 12:30 to 1 p.m. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.